Welcome to The Hype Within, exploring journeys of authentic leadership and growth. On the show, tech leaders will share their stories of developing their leadership skills and challenges they faced along the way. You'll learn about their approaches to self-reflection and personal growth, and how they've been able to build a foundation of authenticity that has propelled them to success. I'm your host, Hana Jacover, B2B marketing leader turned leadership and executive coach. Are you ready to get hyped up? Let's dive in. Hey leaders, welcome back to The Hype Within. I'm your host and executive coach, Hana Jacover, and I am joined today by Lauren Magistro, fellow leadership coach. And I always am so excited to chat with other coaches about their own leadership journey, because we somehow have these very unique stories that lead us into becoming coaches. So that is one piece of the conversation that I'm really excited to dive into. And then also how, Lauren, you are approaching coaching today and what you're seeing, what's working, and how leaders can leverage things like coaching and other tools and resources to further develop. So welcome. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. I am doing well today. I'm excited to dive into this topic. I love chatting with other coaches, and leadership is such an area that I'm really passionate about. So excited to dive in.
Me too. Well, if you wouldn't mind, can you give me a little bit of a background of kind of your journey into leadership and maybe what your leadership style is too?
Yeah, definitely. So my name's Lauren Magistro, and I am a leadership coach. I focus primarily on women leaders who are kind of manager, director, VP level in go-to-market teams. And really, a reason I focus on that group is I feel like that is kind of who I have been, and thinking about my past versions of myself as a leader. And my leadership journey, I think I'm based in San Francisco. I've worked at 5 or 6 different startups kind of in Silicon Valley, and been in these kind of rapidly growing, rapidly changing environments. And pretty early on in my career, I was moved into a management position where I was leading people. And I felt like I really didn't know that much about what I was doing. I had some natural strengths that helped me, which I think have now led me to coaching. But I think early on, being in that position where I kind of had to figure it out as I went along is what has led me kind of to where I am now, focusing on this group of both emerging leaders and established leaders. And most recently, I was a VP of customer success at a company called Tubular Labs. And then for the last year or so, I've been now full-time in my coaching business. And I guess in terms of my leadership style, I think of it as a really kind of a mix of being a heart-led leader and, being analytical and using my head as well, and kind of a unique mix of the two. I would say as a leader, I have a high degree of emotional intelligence. I really leverage relationships as a key to kind of my success as a leader, and being able to work with my team and different teams to get things done. And I also really like to take a strengths-based approach with helping people to develop, really highlighting where are their kind of unique talents that they can leverage and bring out, more fully. And yeah, I always try to have fun and find ways to make work more fun and bring appreciation into the team, and, really bring that as a way to help build trust, so that, when things get harder or there's change or things get disrupted, you kind of have that to fall back on with your relationships.
Yeah, great approach. And you said something that activated me because I'm so passionate about it, is people are not trained to become leaders most of the time. And we know as coaches, only 10% of people are naturally great leaders, or they possess all of the skills to be great leaders. And it's such a gap. It drives me wild that it's such a gap that exists. And I think it's improving, where we're starting to see more leadership development and training come into companies or organizations that are highlighting that. But I still think it's a pretty large gap and challenge to obtain the budget and know what kind of programs to put in place. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that most of my experience has been in the startup environment. And I think depending on what series of funding and what stage of growth you're in, like companies have had more or less resources to put behind things like coaching and training and enablement. But I do feel like, it is becoming more popular, at least with the clients that I work with. A lot of them are getting stipends or like budgets to put towards like programs of their choice. And that's definitely encouraging. It is kind of like mind boggling just when you think about it. You're like, okay, we identify these high performers, we identify talent who are individual contributors, but we see something in them, or the company's growing just so rapidly that we're promoting from within, which is wonderful. And I'm a huge, proponent of that. But then just to kind of like thrust them in and be like, okay, now like figure it out. I think that it's sort of that what got you here, like won't get you there. Like what made you amazing as an individual contributor, those things are still important as a leader and a manager, but there's a whole new set of things that like you need to kind of figure out, like how to delegate and how to set boundaries so you don't burn out. And a lot of those pieces, I feel like when you don't get taught them, like you learn the hard way because later on you're like, oh no, how did I end up here?
Yeah, absolutely. And not to mention and one thing we talk a lot about on this show, just having it be centered around authentic leadership, is we don't talk about the leader development part enough. And it's like what you mentioned are a lot of those leadership skills. And I think developing individually as a leader is so important. And we don't talk about that work because it also does seem to kind of seep a little bit more into the personal development, because I do think they go hand in hand, but it's absolutely necessary for us to do that leader individual development before we step into the leadership positions. And I think that's also another reason why we see a lot of emerging leaders kind of sit back and they're like, why isn't this working?
Yeah, definitely. I think that like a big part of what I talk about with my clients and what I kind of my philosophy, I guess, is like that we are all leaders, no matter what your title is. And like you're the leader of your own world at minimum. And so it starts with like leading yourself and, having like self-awareness and being able to like self-manage and show up in the way that you want. And I think a lot of times too, when people are getting frustrated if they're not getting promoted or they're feeling like, well, I want to be a leader, but like, why isn't anybody letting me? And I like to kind of help them see that you can just start leading now. Like you don't need to wait until you have a title. And so I think that's another shift that it can be empowering, I think, for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And so how have you translated your leadership style and those attributes that you mentioned? How have you translated that into coaching?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is those are the kinds of clients that I tend to attract now. I think that, I work a lot, like I feel like my personal journey with my career and leadership, I had a lot of imposter syndrome. I had a lot of like perfectionist tendencies. I had a lot of like people pleasing, they're not things that you just outgrow like overnight. But I think a lot of what I learned through having, access to a coach or working with a coach in different programs, it helped me like repattern a lot of those things and realize that like I didn't have to keep operating in these ways. And they might have been what made me get to that point. Like I think having perfectionist tendencies, and getting a lot of praise and high achievements and stuff did definitely help me like get to where I was. But I started to realize like this isn't sustainable, and like just feeling anxious wasn't how I wanted to operate anymore. So I think now what I look back on how I was able to grow and transform myself. And then, I really want to offer that to others out there who are in a similar boat. And so I think the way that's like translated into like my coaching business is it's like the people that I'm trying to serve, it's influenced that. And then I think it's also really like the way that I coach. Like I always try to bring in helping people tap into their authentic leader identity and like what are their values, what makes them unique, like how to bring all of that to your leadership style and trying to help people realize that like you don't have to lead just based on somebody else's sort of playbook. And I think especially like as women, a lot of times like I would look around and realize like the people that I saw in leadership, were operating, like super direct or more aggressive or more just like not worrying about people's feelings and just trying to like get things done and not stopping to pause or be thoughtful. And at first I started to feel like, well, I don't belong here because that's not how I operate. But then I started to realize like, no, there's just another way. And so I like to work with clients who are interested in like finding that way for themselves that, maybe they haven't seen before in kind of modeled around them.
Yeah, I think we get so hung up on like this is the way to do something or it's something's good or something's bad, all of those labels, when in reality you can really pave your own way and make your own definition. It can be so subjective that you don't really know who owns that definition that you're referencing and how valuable is it then and how is that serving you? So rewiring that is such a good process to go through. Your story is very similar to my story as well in my career. And what I love about being a coach is we're never approaching a conversation with a coachee and being like, well, this is how I got out of burnout, or this is how I dealt with my imposter syndrome, but we've been there. And so it's like the guiding and holding space without the attachment of the perspective that I think is so powerful. And that's why I do love hearing stories from other coaches, because we're not telling our stories like that on the daily, maybe as you would if you were a mentor or a consultant. And so I always just find it really interesting that like, even though we've been there, like we've been in these really hard places and have gone through a lot of these steps to pull ourselves out of that, we never assume that what worked for us is what will work for somebody else. And I think that's just part of the magic of being a coach.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it gives like instant credibility. Somebody's like, oh, I know what you're going through because like I've been there too. And I feel like it also is a sort of a way to like, it sort of like fast forwards past all the need to like explain about what's going on, because it's just like, oh, I can just start with where I am rather than having to give like a whole bunch of backstory and having to like try to describe what that experience is. But yeah, I totally agree. I think what I love about coaching and what like I feel like clients have said to me and like testimonials and wins and things is like, you help me see that everything is already inside of me. Like you just asked me questions and you helped me discover that. And so I think that part of it, that's like, yes, we get it, but also it's not really about us, it's about them and helping them discover that and kind of find themselves.
Yeah. I just thought of a question that I wanted to ask you around coaching. What do you think the biggest misconception around coaching is today?
That's a good question. I think misconception. Maybe some people come into it thinking you're going to like give them advice or like kind of give them a plan. And what I found, which is what like excited me about becoming a coach, was like, oh, I don't have to know the answers for my clients. Yeah. It's not about that actually at all. Like it's the opposite. And it's just about curiosity and listening and like connecting the dots and helping people see things in a different perspective. And so I think sometimes, actually, I feel like this is not really answering that question exactly, but I feel like there's kind of a misconception with management, and that management is like telling people what to do or like supervising them. And really, I feel like management is all about how do you bring in a coach approach and how do you like bring some of those just curiosity and like with suspending judgment so that you can like actually uncover like what are people's challenges or how are they overcoming them and helping them like shift a perspective to see it differently. And I feel like that is a big thing that I, like to teach on in terms of new managers and stuff.
And I think those things totally go hand in hand too, because sometimes at the management or leadership level, you see leaders who are like, I'm coaching my team. But then when you kind of dig into it, the definition of coaching is not the definition that we would maybe want to see in that sort of environment. You know, it's more of like, I'm a sports coach versus I'm a professional coach.
Yeah.
And so I do think those two things totally go hand in hand. I would also say too, thinking that coaching is only necessary when something's a problem or when something's like super acute, when in reality, I feel like it's the opposite. Like coaching is powerful in those moments, but I do feel like sometimes it dips into more of the like coaching for compliance arena, which isn't successful at all.
Yeah.
And instead, like thinking about it from your strengths-based approach that you mentioned, right? You have so many strengths, you have so much potential, all of these opportunities, and going at it from that angle, which is sort of that like fresh slate of look at all the things that you're going to do.
Yeah, definitely. I think that for coaching to really be the most successful, whoever is signing up for coaching like has to want that. Like they have to be leaned in. There's a coach and the coachee, and then there's like the magic that happens in this relationship that's created. And if one person is like, oh, I got told I have to show up to this and I don't really want to be here and I feel like it's punishment, then, you know, you're like maybe checking a box, but half the equation is missing.
Yes, it rarely works for those. Okay, I would love to hear a little bit about your inspirations or influences in your leadership journey.
Yeah, I was kind of reflecting on this question last night, and the person who stood out the most to me more as like a public figure is Brené Brown. I think a lot of her work has really been inspiring to me, especially I mentioned I am like a recovering perfectionist. I think, you know, one of her books, The Gifts of Imperfection, was really powerful for me in thinking about like, oh, it's not actually about being perfect. It's about how do I grow and learn. And I think like early on in my career, I had trouble getting critical feedback because of this like perfectionist identity and feeling like it meant I wasn't good enough. And so I think some of her work has really helped me like shift my perspective on that. And then I also love the work that she's done on like emotions and kind of like being able to name our emotions as leaders and really being able to help, you know, just with like self-awareness and self-management and realizing the impact that you have on other people if you're not kind of like managing your own stuff. But I think more than anything, what her work kind of helped me see is like, oh, I actually belong as a leader. Like, I think sometimes like early on, you know, like you might question if you belong or not. Like maybe you get into that position, you get into the room, you get into the meeting, and you just have the oh shit moment of like, wait, maybe I don't, maybe I'm not ready for this, or maybe I don't belong. And I feel like her just whole approach and demeanor like helped me see that, no, there is a place for me. And, you know, I have an influence beyond like her specifically. I think like definitely mentors, past managers and coaches, and have been really pivotal, I think, in my development as a leader. And I think helping me to leverage my own strengths or helping. I think I had one CRO who was a leader who managed me, and he like really took a coaching kind of approach where it used to frustrate me actually, because I would feel like, why didn't you just giving me the advice that I want? Or like, I don't know how to solve this problem. I've never done it before. And I just like wanted someone to tell me what to do. And in the moment, it's hard, but overall, you're like, you actually learn a lot more that way. And so I think that definitely helped me level up, you know, as a director and getting to a VP level by having somebody who wasn't going to just tell me what to do, help me figure it out on my own.
I love Brené as well, and especially how she's evolved in her work and being a little bit more inclusive and thinking about where these pieces are coming from or originating from. And I love her messages around self-love. I think that's so important. She wrote a book with, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to put it in the show notes. I don't have it in my color.
In your library behind.
No, I don't have it in my little library. but I'll have to put it in the show notes. I'll share it with you, but it's a really good book, and it's really all about like self-love and self-care.
I was just going to say, one of the coaching programs that I did as an individual, which I feel like was super pivotal in my leadership, but also just in my life, was this program called Unfuck Your Brain. And the woman who leads it, Carl Lowenthal, she, her whole message really is about like, the only reason we don't do things, that maybe we're afraid to do is because we're afraid of like the negative, mean things we're going to say to ourselves, like if we fail. And so it's like it all just starts with like, if you can commit to like fully loving and being your own best friend and having your own back, like no matter what, then like you can really try anything. Because ultimately, if that's the main thing you're afraid of, like if that's not a problem, then you have just a lot more confidence.
Totally. And I think too, it sort of takes us back to when you're thinking about leadership and development as a leader, you sort of have to do that work. If you aren't there already, you have to do that work because you can only fake it for so long. I don't believe in fake it till you make it. I think that is a completely unsustainable mindset. I think that there's so much more power in developing and knowing within yourself, and that is going to carry you through and actually allow you to face the challenging moments where you're standing there and you're like, oh shit. And just as you said, you're like, no, I know that I can do this and I have my back and I have the confidence and courage, and like being able to hype yourself up in that way, I think is so powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things, like the title of your podcast, The Hype Within. It's like all about how do you have that self-belief and that commitment, even if you're like, oh, I've never done it before, but like I figured out lots of hard things before and I know that I could do it again. And I think that just that reminder when you're like right at the edge of like, oh, should I do it or not? It's like, okay, well, I've never done this, but I believe in myself and I'm going to bet on that.
Yeah. And what do you have to lose? Which is always a fun coaching question.
Yeah.
People.
Yeah.
Okay. I am curious. Tell me about a turning point or a breakthrough in your leadership journey that really allowed you to step into that growth and transformation for yourself.
Yeah. I think a really specific time for me was probably about 6 months into my first role as a director. And I had moved from ad tech into a software company and like definitely felt a shift from being in that new world and in this new level where I had a lot more responsibility and just like a seat at the table with the C-suite and, this kind of role where I was now managing like a really large global team responsible for all the revenue of the company. And the person who hired me, she went out on maternity leave 1 month after I joined. And for those like 6 months, or 5 months that she was gone, I felt like I was like, okay, I can do this for a little while. I felt like I was just sort of treading water. I felt like I didn't know what I was doing. I definitely felt a lot of imposter syndrome, but I also just like worked really hard. And, I leaned on the things that I knew were my go-tos of like building relationships, learning from my peers, figuring out like what were the kind of current problems on the team, what processes needed to be evolved and stuff. But I think coming into that role and feeling like I had the person who was supposed to be like guiding me, wasn't there anymore. And, the place that we were as a business was like our renewal rates weren't where they needed to be. I led the customer success team and I just felt like there was a lot of pressure to fix it. I think in that moment, I remember having like a tearful conversation with my boss, the CRO, and just feeling like this is unsustainable. Like I'm working so much and I'm not happy here. But I think what really got me through was one, I did start working with a coach during that time period. And I feel like that like really helped me see that I wasn't supposed to know everything. Like my role wasn't to have all the answers. My role was really to set the vision, create a compelling mission for the team, make sure I had the right talent on board, make sure that we were focusing on the right things and not trying to control like the outcome of everything, which I think was how I started off, feeling like they hired me, so I have to show results. Otherwise, like they made a bad decision.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think realizing that it wasn't all on me and that I also could ask for help, or I could say like, we need to hire certain people. Like one of the things I implemented was there weren't regional managers. And so immediately I was like, we need to have like another layer of leadership on the team. It wasn't really sustainable to support that. Looking back now, it was really challenging in the moment, but I feel like it was a really pivotal growth point for me in my own career to be able to figure out how do I operate at this new level and kind of shift my identity of feeling like I didn't need to do everything myself. It's really about building the team that could operate without you. I don't really need you as like a bottleneck.
That's an awesome experience. I'm sure scary at the time. And we have honestly so much in common. I had a very similar experience when I stepped into my first director role in a startup, and my boss went on maternity leave like the next month.
Yes.
We were in like a really high stakes growth period. It was intense. And funny enough, it felt very calm for me during that time. Like I think at first it freaked me out. But I started freaking out more when she came back, because then it was like we had been able to do so much. And I felt like, okay, if we were able to do all of that, what's the expectation going to be now that she's back? And we started running really, really fast. It was after that I got really burnt out.
Yeah. And I think like, in my experience, I think I like fooled them. I worked so hard. And when she came back, they were like, oh, well, like you have it going, like she's going to move to marketing. And I was like, no. I like do not, like I was not, that's not what I signed up for. But I think the key thing is giving people that freedom and that green space to step into that, and like giving them that feeling of like a little bit of discomfort and being like, oh shit, I've never done this. But at the same time, I feel like doing that with support so that you're not feeling like it's all on you.
Totally agree. You mentioned something that I want to talk about. These two words drive me wild. I want to hear what you believe imposter syndrome to be.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I feel like I also am like question those two words, but it's like there isn't another word for it that's widely like accepted. But I really think of it as it's actually a sign that you're just on the right path. If you are a person that values growth, and I think most humans value learning and growth and evolution, and you feel bored if you're like stagnant, I like to think of it as like it's actually a clue that you're exactly where you want to be, and that it's only coming up because you haven't done it before. And so I think it's really just a sign that you're like, oh, I've worked really hard and now I'm getting this reward, and that's a good thing. And sort of pausing to like remind yourself of that in that moment, I think is really important, so that then you can say, okay, well, what are all the times or what's all the evidence that's shown me that I've figured out new things in the past, and how do I just sort of stay calm and know that it's just sort of this like, it's like this fear kind of based response that comes up, and feeling like you should know more than you do. I think that was what my imposter brain always tells me, is like, you need to know everything. And I think just sort of realizing like that's unrealistic and not even the expectation, and sort of being able to pause and like shift to a place where you can be like, no, actually my role is to learn things, not to know everything.
Yes, I love that. And as I suspected, very similar. I use that term because it is what people are used to seeing and using, and that's what they identify with.
Yeah.
I hope that in a year I don't have to use, like, I don't want to use that term anymore. I really don't.
I really don't like the syndrome part. Like, it sounds like it's this diagnosis that is like permanent.
Yeah,
exactly.
It makes people think something's wrong with them.
Yeah.
And that actually was not what it was supposed to be. Like the woman, I don't know if you know the story behind it, but the woman, I forget her name, but the psychologist who came up with this theory, it was actually imposter phenomenon. And yes, and
that's rebranded.
I know. There are articles and interviews where the rebranding of that, like she's even frustrated by it. It was not meant to be called imposter syndrome. It was always imposter phenomenon. And that was then sort of taken and twisted. But even that, like I like to remove the terminology and just go to essentially where you went. I like your approach. And for me, I focus on naming that emotion of fear and kind of peeling back the layers of like, what is the fear of, right? Is it fear of failure? Is it fear of judgment? It's fear of something. And then thinking about that in how can we reframe that fear as fuel and power. And you've done these things before, you've faced fear before, and thinking about bringing those moments, those strengths that you use then into this moment here. So I feel like we're very aligned on that, and we should just get rid of it.
Yeah, I actually I use the word gremlins as like maybe your imposter is like one of your gremlins, like you have other gremlins, but it's just those inner critic voices and sort of like being able to separate out like who's the part of you that is like the leader within you and who's the part of you that's like a saboteur gremlin voice that's just trying to keep you safe. And I feel like that imposter gremlin is like, it's serving a purpose. It's trying to keep you safe. It's just, you're not a caveman anymore. You're not really going to die. It's just like your body thinks that is what's happening.
You mentioned saboteurs. Have you done any of the positive intelligence training or research on that?
I haven't done the actual training. I have taken the like saboteur assessment, but I did my coach training through the Coactive Training Institute, and they use saboteurs as part of their training. And I think Shirzad like spun out of CTI in creating positive intelligence.
Yeah, that's why I was curious, because you did. I love that resource. It's really an easy way for people to identify the way that they self-sabotage without just saying you have imposter syndrome and saying, it's more than just one way too. We all have a judge that is going to point their finger and tell us we're not doing things good enough, or however your judge looks and sounds. Mine's called Ursula, and she is nasty. But yeah, like thinking about all the other ways that you sabotage yourself, I think is a really amazing way to think about it. I've definitely brought that into some of my client work before.
Yeah, I like to have people like interview them like as if they're like a character, you know, and like actually identify like how are they personified? Do they have a name? Because then when it comes up, you're like, oh, that's just Ursula being Ursula, whatever, you know. And you can kind of make it more playful and have a joke about it.
Yes. I'm curious. This is an area where as a coach, I struggle with the balance of I love tools like that and the visualization, a lot of which I know CTI does, connecting with your inner child. How do you bring that into a more professional executive coaching session in a way where it's palpable for somebody who's a CMO or a CRO or a CFO, and they're like, I don't want to fucking do that bullshit exercise?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And that's actually something I remember came up a lot in my, like while I was in training with CTI is like, okay, well, this is all well and good in this forum, but like, how would you do this with like these kinds of people? I kind of like to judge it based on who I'm seeing in front of me. And sometimes I'll just say like, hey, are you open to experimenting with me for a moment? Or like, how would you feel about this? Or sometimes I'll even just bring it in a way that's like not going all the way in, but it's sort of like, hey, we're on Zoom, like, let's stand up. That was like one of the things that one of the coaches who led one of the sessions, he was like, that's my favorite thing to say as a coach is let's stand up and like, just sort of like create a different geography in the environment that you're in and move around. I also am big into yoga, and I just did my yoga teacher training. So sometimes I'll just bring in like a little bit of breath work, like let's take a few breaths and close our eyes just as a way to like recenter. I have one client where I felt like it was becoming more of a problem solving call. And I was like, okay, let's stand up. Let's close your eyes. I just sort of like had her envision something in front of her. And then afterwards, she was like, whoa, that was wild, you know, and just sort of like had new insight into like how to lead her team. So I don't know. I feel like it's like kind of judging the situation and maybe just offering it. 'Cause sometimes like we don't know what people are open to, and like might be surprised that people are like ooh, that was fun and different.
Yeah, I was going to say sometimes people really surprise me if I
Yeah.
just sort of open up the door a little bit and
Yeah.
see if they want to come in. And yeah, some of the most unsuspecting individuals, I'm like, oh, well, shows me for making that assumption.
Yeah. And I think that's actually something too, like I know for me when I was going through my coach certification, like you have supervision and you have to record your calls and have them reviewed.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my supervisor was like really challenging me with one of my clients to like go farther, and I was like, I feel really uncomfortable doing that. But you kind of also have to push yourself as a coach. Sometimes you just fall into what you feel comfortable with too. And
Totally. Well, that I think is a perfect segue because speaking of comfortable, I'm curious about shaking things up and thinking about disrupting traditional leadership. I have a personal feeling that just where we are in today's society with the generational shift that we're seeing, I feel like we are on a path to a very big shift in leadership. But I do think it is because we're seeing this disruption of like you've got millennials coming in and they're like, wait a second, like I've been wearing this mask for 10 years. Like, what is this? You've got Gen Z coming in who's acting just themselves and they're like, no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah.
And you just have these waves of disruption that I see them as positive. And I think that they're leading us to a really interesting, positive space in terms of leadership that's way more authentic, way more open, way more human centric. And I'm curious when you're working with leaders or even just thinking about some of the things that they can be doing to seek out how can we challenge traditional leadership norms a little bit more. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I just was listening to a podcast and I forgot the guy's name, but he was the CEO of Joie de Vie Hotels and he was brought in by Airbnb and they called him like an modern elder is what they called him because he was like in his 50s and the founders of Airbnb were in their 20s and they were like, you have so much experience that we don't have. And they brought him in and it was just so interesting because he was talking all about the value of these intergenerational like differences coming into work and like really creating like, it's sort of like you have the wisdom of people who've gone through a lot of experiences, but you also have the like creativity and the like excitement and like enthusiasm of these like younger generation. And I feel like it's really cool to see that working in that way because I feel like you also have examples of that not working out so well in other environments. But yeah, I think seeing how that is all coming together is really exciting. I guess when I think about like disrupting leadership, the way that I see that happening in terms of like the human element is like, I think there's just a lot more care that like can go into how we think about leadership because at the end of the day, we're all people. At one point I got feedback that I should like degaff, like I shouldn't care so much. And I was like, but that's what makes me like me is like, I do care. It's a balance of like, you still need to be tough sometimes, but you also like, I really value people. That's why I have a network now where people respect me because I cared about them. As we're thinking about the future, like I definitely think a more empathetic, caring type of leader are going to thrive and hopefully be building businesses in a more sustainable way where we aren't like having like massive layoffs every year because, we weren't really being thoughtful about it. And hopefully like maybe there's even more creativity of like, how can we repurpose people or give them new opportunities or temporary assignments, in between if there are like ebbs and flows in recruiting, like maybe we can repurpose people for different projects. And like, I think just thinking about like people are adaptable. And if people are willing to try and learn new things, then I think leaders who can embrace that, like will, I hope, be the ones who thrive in the end, in the future.
Yeah, I agree. And I think too, focusing on, and I believe that because you care, you do this, is focusing on, well, what motivates you? What is the motivation behind you being here or you doing this thing and using that. And I think even when we make that connection, it then allows us to come up with more creative solutions around that specific individual, or whether it's how do I get all of these people who are motivated by different things to work together. So yeah, I think you're spot on, having that high empathy and caring and just building environments of trust. Like, that is disruptive, sadly enough.
Yeah. It's funny to me, it doesn't feel disruptive because I'm like, well, that's just how I've operated, but it really is like, and I think that's why a lot of times I felt like, oh, maybe I don't belong, because I feel like I was going against the grain a little bit. And but yeah, I think like that piece of identifying people's motivations, I made it a point to stand up in front of my team, and once a year I would say like, look, this is only one stop in your career journey. I know you're not going to be here forever. Like I will consider my job a job well done if like you get to where you want to go next because something you learned here. Like, so let's identify what that is, because either it means, yeah, we have the opportunity here and we're growing at a high enough rate that you can get that here, or, you know, maybe that's elsewhere. But I was like, my goal is to like help you develop. And I think that like was genuine, and it built a lot of loyalty and engagement from people too, because then I would basically be able to like have this puzzle of, okay, you want this thing, here are all the projects or the things that are in front of me, how do I match you with those things so that you're getting what you want, but you know, we're also spreading out the work or accomplishing the goals of the business at the same time. But if you don't know what those things are about people on your team, then it's really hard to link them up with those things.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple times we've mentioned empathy and EQ, and I think that those are two of the most important qualities that a leader can have to be successful. And I'm wondering whether it's in your own journey or thinking about how you encounter this within coaching, but how do you nurture that empathy and emotional intelligence with a team, especially when there's challenging situations or conflicts? Like, how do you balance all of that?
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think like emotional intelligence is so crucial for leadership. And I really love a lot of the work that Daniel Goleman has done. I use a lot of his research in kind of the workshops that I run and assessments that I do. Yeah, I think like first and foremost, I like to start with yourself and thinking about like there's 4 quadrants of EQ. 2 are about you and 2 are about you with others. So like starting with your self-awareness and your self-management. And I mentioned at the beginning, like Brene Brown's work is inspiring to me, you know, because a lot of it is just about your own emotions. Like, we're humans, we have feelings. We're not trying to get rid of them. We're just trying to like be aware of them and to use them in a way that is like beneficial to ourselves and others. So I think about how do we give people tools to identify their own emotional states, and to then creating those moments where you can pause and sort of be like, oh, okay, I'm feeling angry right now. Like, what is causing that? And, you know, mindfully kind of be able to move through that and process that feeling so that you don't just then dump it onto your neighbor or your peer or your direct report in the meeting, you know, because that isn't going to be beneficial. So I think starting with yourself is what I like to teach either or share with people who I was leading in corporate jobs or, you know, with clients as well. And then I think from there, you can then use that to then make it your superpower to be able to like read other people's emotions or to be able to build relationships and use that to then influence and get things done through other people, which the higher levels you go in leadership, the more those skills are important. Like, you know, just having the hard skills isn't going to help you, you know, when you're the CMO or the CRO. Like, you got to have that ability to relate to people and communicate and listen. And I feel like those are really big skills that a lot of people can start developing now. Like, you don't have to wait until you're at that level. You shouldn't wait at that level.
Yeah, please don't. Don't wait. Yeah, I totally agree. And as you do accelerate in your leadership journey, being in the C-suite or even in front of a board, in front of investors, emotional intelligence is going to get you so far because it's going to help you manage conflict and help you work through those situations because you know how to regulate yourself first and foremost. And you are tracking the interactions and the emotions around you in the room. And you know also how to manage those, or at least how to acknowledge them at the very least. It's so crucial for conflict and working through conflict successfully because conflict is so natural and it's not good or bad. It just is either do we have productive conflict or unproductive conflict. And I do think that it depends on your emotional intelligence to be able to really manage all of that.
Yeah. And like, are you avoiding the conflict altogether because it makes you nervous? Like a lot of times, like, it's just crazy how many things like are, I feel like, tied to emotional intelligence, like giving feedback or like change management or even communication. Like a lot of these things are really like tied into this concept, and it's very deep and, you know, has like a lot of different facets to it. So it's one of my favorite things to explore is because I feel like it's tied to so many different things.
Yes, mine too. Mine too. And you mentioned Daniel Goleman. I absolutely love his work. And I just wanted to mention he has his book around emotional intelligence that's really powerful. I think really made a lot of changes, I think, for the industry and how we think about emotional intelligence, how we bucket it. But most people, I feel like, probably know him for his Primal Leadership book, which I think is a little bit more recent. But I just wanted to mention that's a great resource in itself. And his work is really, really outstanding.
Yeah. There's a video like on YouTube that he talks about like in an engineering team, like two different people, basically one like really just focused on like their own code and like doing what their like day-to-day job was. And the other like did that, but also met all her coworkers and tried to understand what people's challenges were. Obviously, that person is like the one who's going to get ahead. And so it's just like demonstrating that you might think, oh, those are like an afterthought. Oh, once I get my job done, then I'll focus on those things. No, those are like really a part of your job.
Yeah, so true. Well, I could talk to you about that all day. We could like create stories for probably a year. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing. One last question. I'm thinking about experiences, exercises, resources, anything in that realm for the emerging executives out there that are looking to accelerate in their personal and professional growth. What would you recommend?
For me, community is huge. So if you're in that position where you're like stepping into a new level, either like as a new manager or as a new executive, I feel like looking for a community of people that's in a similar place is like really powerful. One, to know that you're not alone and to have resources who are going through a similar experience. Like I feel like it was really helpful for me. And, you know, that's why I've also created programs like that for that exact kind of purpose. And I feel like that is a big thing that I would recommend is looking for like a group or a network. I know we met through the Women in Revenue group, but finding those communities to support you is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will link to some of Lauren's resources that she has available as well that will be helpful in your journey and looking to kind of marry that personal and professional growth so you can excel in your leadership journey. And I know that you had this on here, but like we're both coaches, so let's work with a coach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't want to like shamelessly plug too blatantly, but yeah, I think hiring a coach or getting access if your company provides that, like game changer. Like it helped me personally like stay at my company longer because there were times where I was like, I'm going to give up, and it helped me see that there's opportunity, or just to feel more empowered, or to realize that like you just have that support system and that third party. I think it's super powerful. So yeah, hire a coach.
Absolutely. All right, Lauren, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your stories. I appreciate you, and I really enjoyed hearing about your journey, and I know others will as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Hana. It was really fun.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. I hope you walk away with something empowering that you can take into your own leadership journey. Are you a high-performing executive looking to take your career to the next level? Or maybe you're an emerging leader who wants to develop the skills you need to advance in your role and show up authentically. Or maybe you're experiencing burnout and struggling to find a better work-life balance. Whatever your situation is, one-on-one coaching can help you achieve your personal and professional goals. If you're interested in experiencing the power of coaching for yourself, head on over to hypehousecoaching.com/start coaching now, where you can set up a one-on-one leadership and executive coaching intro session for free. Remember, the only hype that really matters is the hype within.